something new entered Ethiopian airspace, and defense analysts noticed it immediately. The flight pattern was wrong for a jet, too steady for a helicopter, and it stayed in the sky far longer than any aircraft Ethiopia had ever operated before. It wasn't listed in civilian registries, it wasn't Western, and it wasn't something the country was known to possess. Weeks later, a technical confirmation quietly appeared. Ethiopia had become the first foreign operator of Russia's Orion E mail drone. No explanation followed. No purpose was stated. Just a single fact that shifted Ethiopia into a completely different category of military capability. The real mystery isn't what the drone is. It's why Ethiopia needed this level of power without telling anyone what it plans to use it for. Let's find out. The real reason Ethiopia went for a mail drone had nothing to do with prestige or military flexing. It had to do with a much simpler, more uncomfortable reality. The country had outgrown its own ability to understand what was happening inside its borders. Ethiopia is not just large, it is fragmented, layered, and constantly shifting. You have remote border regions where the state barely exists physically, urban zones that change politically every few months, trade corridors that double as migration routes, and vast rural areas where entire communities can move without ever appearing in official data. On paper, the country looks stable. On the ground, it behaves like several different systems running at different speeds. For years, Ethiopia tried to manage this with traditional tools: police reports, military patrols, satellite imagery purchased from foreign providers, and intelligence summaries shared by external partners. The problem is that all of this information arrived late, filtered, and incomplete. By the time something showed up in a report, it had already happened. By the time satellite images were analyzed, the situation on the ground had changed. The state was constantly reacting to yesterday's reality, while today's reality was already slipping out of view. This created a dangerous gap between what was officially known and what was actually happening. Armed groups didn't need to defeat the state. They just needed to move faster than its perception systems. Smuggling networks didn't need to hide. They just needed to operate in areas that weren't monitored continuously. Even basic things like population movement, resource flows, and infrastructure usage became guesswork instead of measurable data. Ethiopia wasn't losing control because it lacked power. It was losing control because it lacked real-time visibility. And here's the part most people miss. In modern geopolitics, visibility is power, not weapons, not speeches, not alliances. The ability to see patterns as they form is what separates states that manage reality from states that chase it. Ethiopia realized that its biggest vulnerability wasn't enemies, it was blind zones, entire regions that only existed in government awareness through secondhand information and outdated imagery. Decisions were being made based on fragments, assumptions, and foreign interpretations of Ethiopian territory. This is where the Orion E starts making sense. Not as a weapon, but as a perception tool. Ethiopia didn't need more firepower. It needed a way to continuously observe how its own country actually behaves over time. Not snapshots, not reports, not external feeds. A system that could stay in the air long enough to reveal rhythms. Which roads are used regularly, where activity spikes at night, which regions go silent for weeks, and where new movement patterns suddenly emerge. Once you understand that, the secrecy around the purchase becomes logical. Ethiopia wasn't buying something to show the world. It was buying something to finally see itself properly, without relying on foreign eyes or delayed information. The Orion E wasn't meant to send a message outward. It was meant to correct a structural weakness inward. And that raises the next, more unsettling question. If a state suddenly gains the ability to observe its entire territory in real time, what does it do with that kind of knowledge once it stops being blind? It uses that knowledge to change how reality is measured. Not through reports, not through human intermediaries, but through a machine that never gets tired, never loses focus, and never leaves the sky. The Orion E is not designed to chase incidents. It is designed to observe continuity. Its main advantage isn't speed or weapons, but endurance. It can stay airborne for nearly an entire day, circling the same region, watching the same roads, listening to the same electronic signals, and recording how activity evolves hour by hour. This is a completely different way of seeing a country. Most surveillance systems capture moments, a border crossing, a convoy, a flare-up. The Orion E captures patterns. It builds a long-term behavioral record of territory. Which roads are active only at night? Which areas suddenly go silent? Where traffic increases gradually over weeks? Where signals appear that weren't there before? Over time, Ethiopia isn't just collecting footage, it's building a machine-readable memory of its own geography. That's what makes this system dangerous in the right hands. The drone's sensors don't just show images. They track movement histories, thermal changes, electronic activity, and infrastructure usage. This allows analysts to reconstruct how a region functions when nothing dramatic is happening. And that's where real intelligence lives, not in explosions, but in routine. Smuggling routes only become visible when you notice which trucks pass the same points every night. Insurgent logistics only emerge when you see which villages suddenly become active after weeks of inactivity. Political instability doesn't start with protests. It starts with subtle population shifts and communication changes. Before the Orion E, Ethiopia could only see these things after they became obvious. Now it can detect them while they're still forming. This shifts intelligence from being descriptive to predictive. The state stops asking what just happened and starts asking what is about to happen. That's the real leap. It's not about watching enemies, it's about modeling society itself. And this is why the Orion E is not comparable to smaller tactical drones. Those are tools for individual missions. The Orion E is a strategic system. It turns airspace into a permanent observation layer. Ethiopia is effectively building a living digital map that updates itself continuously. Over months and years, this becomes an archive of behavior. How regions change, how conflicts evolve, how infrastructure grows or decays, how people move in response to pressure. Once you have that, power becomes mathematical. Decisions are no longer based on opinions or political instincts. They are based on data trends. Security becomes an algorithm. Policy becomes optimization. Even diplomacy changes, because Ethiopia no longer negotiates from uncertainty. It negotiates from internal knowledge. And this is the point where the drone stops being a military asset and becomes something else entirely. A state cognition system. A way for the government to think about itself in real time, using continuous sensory input instead of delayed information. But if a state can model its own behavior with this level of precision, the next step is unavoidable. It won't just watch patterns, it will start intervening before those patterns become visible to anyone else. And when a government moves from observation to preemption, how does that redefine control itself? It starts intervening before anyone even realizes a crisis exists. Once Ethiopia has a continuous stream of long-duration aerial data, the entire logic of governance shifts. Instead of responding to incidents, the state begins managing trajectories. It no longer waits for violence, instability, or disruption to appear in headlines. It detects the conditions that produce those outcomes while they are still invisible to the public. This is where the Orion E stops being about surveillance and becomes about timing. Traditional security systems act after something happens. A border incident, a smuggling operation, a political flare-up. The response is always late, because the signal only becomes visible once damage has already occurred. But with persistent observation, Ethiopia can see the slow buildup that precedes these events. Not dramatic moments, but small changes. Unusual night traffic on a normally quiet route, gradual shifts in settlement patterns, sudden bursts of communication activity in previously inactive zones, infrastructure usage increasing in places that don't match economic forecasts. These aren't emergencies. They're early warnings. The power of this is not military in the classic sense, it's administrative. It allows the state to reallocate resources, adjust deployments, and modify policy before problems reach the level of confrontation. A region showing signs of instability can receive infrastructure investment instead of troops. A border corridor showing abnormal movement can be regulated instead of militarized. A political tension zone can be negotiated instead of suppressed. The state gains the ability to shape outcomes instead of managing consequences. This is what predictive governance looks like, not reacting to the present, but engineering the future through early intervention. And this is only possible when you own your perception systems. If your intelligence comes from external partners, you receive information after it has already been processed, interpreted, and filtered through someone else's priorities. With the Orion E, Ethiopia removes the middle layer. It sees raw reality first, not curated reality later. This also changes internal power dynamics. Institutions that previously operated in isolation, such as security, planning, infrastructure, and migration management, now share the same real-time data environment. Decisions become synchronized, policies become coordinated. The state starts behaving like a single integrated system instead of fragmented departments responding to different versions of the same situation. And this is the uncomfortable part. Once a government can anticipate outcomes reliably, it no longer governs through crisis management. It governs through preemption. It doesn't wait for disorder. It dissolves the conditions that produce disorder. It doesn't wait for pressure. It neutralizes pressure before it becomes visible. Control becomes subtle, quiet, and structural. From the outside, nothing dramatic happens. No major operations, no public crackdowns, just fewer surprises, fewer emergencies, fewer moments where the state looks unprepared. Power becomes invisible because it operates in advance of conflict rather than in response to it. This is the real transformation Ethiopia gains. Not dominance through force, but dominance through temporal advantage. The ability to move earlier than everyone else. To see shifts while they're still theoretical. To shape outcomes before they turn into events. And once a state gains that kind of timing advantage, the question is no longer how it will respond to the world, but who else still gets to influence its decisions at all. Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. They stop influencing it because the middle layer quietly disappears. For most African states, security and strategic decisions have never been based purely on internal knowledge. They've been shaped by external intelligence systems, satellite data provided by Western agencies, mapping platforms owned by foreign companies, threat assessments written by analysts who don't live inside the territory they describe. Even when information was shared generously, it was never neutral. It arrived already interpreted, already framed, already filtered through someone else's priorities. This created a hidden hierarchy of perception. Africa didn't just depend on foreign technology, it depended on foreign ways of seeing. Reality itself was mediated. A border incident wasn't just an incident, it was a report written by someone else. A security threat wasn't just a pattern, it was an external assessment. Policy was built on second-hand vision. The Orion E breaks that structure completely. For the first time, Ethiopia doesn't need to request intelligence about itself. It doesn't need to wait for satellite passes scheduled by someone else. It doesn't need access to Western databases to understand what is happening inside its own territory. It generates its own raw data. It runs its own analysis. It draws its own conclusions. This is not a military upgrade. It is a perception upgrade. And perception is where power actually lives, because influence only exists where interpretation exists. If you control how reality is described, you control how decisions are made. That's how Western leverage worked for decades, not through commands, but through frameworks. By controlling the information layer, you shaped what problems looked like, what solutions seemed reasonable, and which actions appeared legitimate. Once Ethiopia owns that layer, the entire mechanism collapses without conflict. There is no argument, no diplomatic rupture, no rejection of alliances. External intelligence simply becomes unnecessary. The middlemen don't get expelled, they become irrelevant. This is why the shift is so dangerous to traditional power structures. You can sanction a country, you can pressure a government, you can even isolate a regime. But you can't easily influence a state that no longer depends on your perception systems. If you don't control the data, you don't control the narrative. And if you don't control the narrative, your leverage becomes symbolic. The most important part is that this transition doesn't look dramatic. There is no visible confrontation. Western embassies remain open. Military cooperation still exists on paper. But underneath, The informational dependency has vanished. Ethiopia is no longer negotiating security from uncertainty. It is negotiating from internal certainty. And once a state reaches that position, outside influence becomes optional. Advice becomes noise. Pressure becomes less effective. Even threats lose impact, because the state already sees the terrain, the trends, and the outcomes for itself. This is what real independence looks like in the modern world. Not flags, not speeches, not slogans, control over how reality is perceived, processed, and acted upon. The Orion E doesn't challenge Western power directly. It removes the conditions that made that power possible in the first place. And if one African country can quietly exit the global intelligence dependency system without confrontation, how long before others realize they can do the same? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. They realize it almost immediately, because Ethiopia didn't just acquire a system, it proved a concept. The real signal to other African states is not the drone itself, but the fact that nothing collapsed after the purchase. No isolation, no catastrophic backlash, no sudden vulnerability. Ethiopia simply integrated a high-tier strategic system and kept moving. That's what makes this dangerous for the old order. It normalizes independence at the infrastructure level. For years, African governments assumed that advanced military intelligence systems came with unavoidable trade-offs. You either bought Western and accepted oversight, conditions, and alignment, or you stayed under-equipped and dependent. Ethiopia just demonstrated a third path: full capability without external supervision. That changes the mental model completely. Now, the conversation inside African defense circles isn't about ideology. It's technical, quiet, practical. Questions like, why are we still renting satellite imagery when we could own persistent aerial platforms? Why do we rely on foreign threat assessments when we could generate our own behavioral data? Why do we structure security around delayed reports instead of real-time models? Once those questions enter the system, they don't go away. This is how technological shifts spread, not through treaties or alliances, but through visible functionality. One country shows it can work, and suddenly the idea becomes legitimate. The Orion E becomes less a Russian product and more a reference architecture. A proof that a non-Western state can operate at the same strategic level as global powers without asking for permission. And the timing matters. Africa is already in the middle of a broader transformation. New payment systems, local data centers, regional trade platforms, and independent telecom infrastructure. Security is the missing piece, the final layer. Once that becomes sovereign too, the entire dependency stack starts breaking apart. Other states don't need to copy Ethiopia's politics, they just need to copy the logic. Diversify suppliers, own perception systems, build internal intelligence layers, reduce informational reliance. Over time, the continent stops behaving like a set of monitored zones and starts behaving like a network of autonomous actors. And this doesn't require a grand declaration. It happens through procurement documents, training programs, technical integration, and quiet upgrades. No one announces the end of dependency. They just stop needing it. The most interesting part is that this shift is invisible to the public. There are no dramatic headlines, no revolutionary speeches. But inside state systems, something fundamental changes. Security planning becomes internal, not outsourced. Reality becomes locally generated, not imported. Power becomes structural, not symbolic. This is why Ethiopia's move is more significant than it looks. It creates a template that others can follow without confrontation. No rebellion, no rupture. Just a slow, quiet exit from the global perception hierarchy. And once enough countries follow that template, the question stops being who controls Africa and becomes whether anyone outside Africa still understands it well enough to influence it at all. It changes everything because the moment a state controls how it sees itself, it also controls how it moves in the world. For most of modern history, African countries have existed inside global systems as objects of analysis. They were studied, mapped, assessed, ranked, and monitored. Policies were written about them, strategies were designed for them, and risks were calculated around them. Even when they acted, They acted inside frameworks defined elsewhere. They were visible, but not sovereign over their own visibility. Ethiopia's Orion E marks a quiet break from that position. When a country owns its own long-endurance aerial intelligence, it no longer needs to wait for external validation of its reality. It doesn't need reports to tell it what's happening. It doesn't need analysts to explain its own behavior. It doesn't need international institutions to translate its situation into risk levels or stability indexes. It generates its own reality in real time and acts directly on that information. This is what it means to stop being a subject and become an actor. An actor doesn't wait to be described. It describes itself. An actor doesn't wait to be interpreted. It interprets. An actor doesn't wait for permission. It decides. The most powerful shift here is not military, it's cognitive. Ethiopia is no longer positioned inside global systems as something to be managed. It is positioning itself as a system that manages. That difference is subtle but permanent. Once a state internalizes its perception infrastructure, it cannot go back to dependency without actively choosing weakness. And this is where the long-term impact becomes unavoidable. Security decisions stop being reactive. Diplomacy stops being speculative. Economic planning stops being guesswork. Everything becomes anchored in internally generated knowledge. The country no longer negotiates based on assumptions or external narratives. It negotiates based on continuous awareness of its own terrain, its own population flows, its own risk patterns, its own strategic corridors. This makes Ethiopia harder to pressure, harder to manipulate, harder to mislead. You can argue with the government. You can sanction a regime. You can influence public opinion. But you cannot easily distort the reality of a state that sees itself clearly. And once one country proves that this is possible, the mental ceiling lifts for everyone else. Africa no longer has to imagine itself as a region that reacts to global power. It can start imagining itself as a region that generates power structurally, through data, infrastructure, perception, and internal intelligence. Not through speeches, not through ideology, through systems. This is the real end of the story. Not that Ethiopia bought a drone, but that it crossed a line most African states have never crossed before. The line between being observed and becoming the observer. And once a continent starts observing itself, designing its own reality, and acting on its own data, the final question isn't whether Africa will change the global order, but whether the global order is even built to survive a world where Africa no longer needs to be explained by anyone else. Let us know in the comments section, do you think Africa is doing what is long overdue? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.